Greetings and welcome back. In this mini lecture, I want to start moving into roles and expectations of the presidency. And this is one of the areas where every textbook that I've used over the years has really looked at this very, very differently. I've had some textbooks discuss three roles, basically foreign policy roles, domestic policy roles, and kind of moral leadership. I had one textbook, I believe, that looked at 15 different roles. And certainly your book mentions some roles that I am not going to talk about. For example, if I were to add a sixth role, I would add the one that is discussed in the book, and that is the chief budgeter role. Certainly, there is nothing in the Constitution that makes it appear that the president would play this role. This is a role, the power of the purse, that constitutionally was supposed to belong to the Congress. However, the Congress abdicated its leadership in this area and transferred tremendous power to the president with the Budget Act of 1921, which requires the president to submit an annual budget to Congress. And so kind of the starting point for negotiations budget-wise actually begins with the president. This obviously goes to the Congress. The Congress scrutinizes, refines. In many cases, the Congress may even have a rival budget. There will be a reconciliation of those budgets. So certainly that discussion in your book I find very interesting. I think that it is factually correct. When I created these five roles, I tried to tie these five roles to things that constitutionally you can look at. Certainly, if you were to read the Constitution, there is nothing that would suggest the president would be the chief budgeter. Many books that I've used talks about the president playing the role of chief of party. Certainly, our founding fathers did not see the formation of political parties. George Washington, our first president, used the term baneful to describe political parties. So certainly it is true that today the president is the chief of his party. And if, to me, one of the most amazing things about the Trump presidency is how it has transformed the Republican Party. A lot of the ideas the Republican parties believed in for decades and decades and decades, they have abandoned because this president doesn't believe in them. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. The Republican Party traditionally considered itself the party of fiscal restraint. This is a political party. We don't believe in debt. We want to try to get to balanced budgets. If you take a look at the Trump presidency, the budget deficit has skyrocketed under this president. The Republicans traditionally were a free trade party. Donald Trump has preached protectionism and economic nationalism, and the party has kind of caved to that tune. So many things, and I could go on with the list, but I'm kind of straying away from the lecture. But the point is that the president does play the role of chief of party, and very few people have really transformed their party in recent decades as much as this president has his. And whether you like that or not probably depends on what political party you happen to belong to. The five roles that I want you to focus in on for exam purposes are the five that are in your notes. The first one, when I ask you about it, chief of state, is one that traditionally has distinguished presidential systems, like the United States, for example, or Mexico, for example, from a parliamentary system like Great Britain. When I ask you the question, performing as chief of state on the exam, the answer is the president performs ceremonial tasks and symbolizes national unity. So if you take a look at a parliamentary system like Britain, like Japan, for example, in Britain, the Queen is the chief of state. She performs ceremonial tasks, and it is the Prime Minister, currently Mr. Johnson, who is the chief executive officer. In the case of the United States, and frankly in the case of other presidential systems, we fuse the dignity of royalty to the working powers of a chief executive. In a sense, the president plays both roles. If the president in Great Britain, you would have a king or queen, a monarch, play the chief of state role. Your book does a good job talking about some of these things. This could be anything from pardoning the Thanksgiving turkeys, lighting the Christmas tree every year, decorating war heroes, having Super Bowl winning teams or Olympic gold medalists come to the White House. And to me, the chief of state role is a slight positive for the president. No one is going to get upset by the president decorating a war hero or celebrating a Super Bowl winning team or pardoning the Thanksgiving turkeys. I still think my favorite Thanksgiving turkeys were when mac and cheese got pardoned by the president. I think it's just because I happen to like mac and cheese. So the chief of state role is a positive role for the president. The president does symbolize national unity. It's a small fraternity of people, 45 presidents in this particular case. And as evidence of this, we mourn our presidents when we lose them. Even presidents that perhaps we didn't personally care for too much when they were alive, when they die, we feel like part of American history has died with them, and I think we tend to mourn them. The second role is one that I want to talk about a little bit because your book adds some elements that perhaps I should have in my notes. So let me just go over very quickly what I have said, and then let me give you a couple of things that I would like you to add into the margins perhaps of your notes. So in my notes for chief executive, it says the Constitution says that presidents are to see that laws are faithfully executed. They do this by appointing people to oversee bureaucratic agencies. The president does have some significant powers in this area, such as the pardon and the reprieve. And I believe that it's true when I ask you on the exam, what role does Randall believe the president is weakest at? It's this role, it's chief executive. And one of the reasons that I personally believe this is that presidents tend to want rapid action, they want innovation, they want to make a historical legacy. And bureaucrats tend to be very status quo oriented. Bureaucrats tend to be wedded to what we call standard operating procedures. And as a result, bureaucrats often resist the initiatives and the actions of presidents. And your book does an excellent job, even during a time of crisis, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States was perhaps as close as it's ever been to a nuclear exchange. The bureaucrats really resisted the notion of a naval blockade. And eventually it got done, but after tremendous kind of uproar and undertaking. My favorite story demonstrating this involves a story during the Carter administration. I stole this from the New York Times. I believe it was January 8th, 1978, if I remember correctly. The White House was having a problem with field mice. It was unusually cold. They were seeking refuge in the White House. They put some traps out and some poison out and had gotten many of them, but a few of the critters had eaten some poison, were right up inside the wall. They had died. The New York Times stated that the president's office was, quote, bathed in the odor of dead mouse. So President Carter sought out the GSA, which takes care of the White House, and they said, "Oh, Mr. President, you said those are field mice. Field mice are outdoor things. We'd love to help you, but you need to call the Interior Department. They take care of the outdoor things." The Interior Department said, "Oh, Mr. President, we'd love to help you, and if you'd have run him over in the driveway, we'd have scooped him right up. But the GSA people are misinterpreting the code book. When they entered the perimeter of the White House wall, they became an indoor mouse, and therefore They need to take care of this, not us. Now, this is an incredibly interesting, it's a very long story. At one point, poor President Carter is so upset, he says to his secretary, I can blow up the planet with nuclear weapons, and I can't get a damn dead mouse out of my office. Yeah, pretty much that's true. To make a very long story short, they had to convene an interagency governmental task force with a member of the GSA and the Interior Department. They agreed on a one-time ad hoc basis to jointly remove the mouse so as one, not to offend either bureaucratic sensibility, and two, not to upset any long-standing precedent. So if you're talking about the paradox of presidential power, great strengths and great weaknesses, there you have it. The planet to blow up the planet with nuclear weapons, tremendous strength. Inability to get a damn dead mouse out of your office, tremendous weakness. So there you go. Now I want to give you the other side of this because Greenberg and Page paint a bit of a different picture than I do. I do want you to star this notion of an executive order. An executive order is a rule or regulation for an executive agency issued by the president with the full force of law. And certainly we have seen executive orders that have made history. I mentioned a couple in an earlier lecture. Certainly the Executive Order 9066, Franklin Roosevelt's order resulting in the internment of Japanese Americans, had a tremendous impact. The Emancipation of Slaves by Abraham Lincoln or Truman's desegregation of the military would all be important. So certainly this notion of executive orders are very, very important. My response to Greenberg, if we were having a discussion in front of you, would be that while it is true that presidents do issue these and they can be important in many ways, and oftentimes bureaucratic agencies will do everything they can to undermine the initiatives or the thrust or the general purpose of that executive order. So you certainly should know what an executive order is. I should have put that in the notes. As you know, I'm scrambling in this course as much as you are with this new format. And I think that face-to-face I would have mentioned it, but I saw in the notes that I had ignored it, so I thought that I would add it. There's one other thing, and this I wouldn't have caught if I hadn't reread the chapter, and I think it's worthy of note, and I think that you should certainly add this to your note. Your book talks about President Trump in this unusual policy that he has articulated as president, this notion of a unitary executive. And certainly your book gives an excellent definition. I'll just basically parrot it to you, although I don't think this is word for word the way that your book puts it. But certainly this very controversial document proposes that the entire executive branch is under the direct control of the president, who has complete control and complete authority to control the actions of federal bureaucratic personnel without interference from any other branch of government. That means that the president can order someone to ignore a congressional subpoena to testify. And certainly we saw this during the impeachment era where several people working for President Trump said that this comes under executive privilege. The president has ordered us not to testify. We're not going to do this at all. And while I personally believe that the president does not have this much power, the notion of the unitary executive, and this is not mentioned in your book, but this goes back to that ambiguity of Article 2 where I began this discussion at the start. Remember, the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. Donald Trump is making the claim that that gives him complete control over the executive branch without any interference from Congress or even the Supreme Court.